Good morning, everyone. It's delightful to see so many of you here this early on a Saturday morning. But we do have a wonderful panel coming up on the impact of this fall's US presidential election on transatlantic relations. To start off our conversation, I would first like to introduce our speakers. On the left, we have Dr. Kori Schake. She is a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She has had an impressive career in government, in the US government. She has worked for the State Department, the Department of Defense, National Security Council, and the White House. And she's the author of 5 books, including one called America versus the West: Can Liberal World Order Be Preserved? Welcome and good morning, Kori.
Thank you, my friend.
And here to my left, we have Ambassador Derek Shearer. He is the Chevalier Professor of Diplomacy and Director of the McKinnon Center for Global Affairs at the Occidental College in Los Angeles. He served as ambassador to Finland from 1994 to 1997 during the Clinton administration, and later he has been a fellow at the Economic Strategy Institute and at the Woodrow Wilson Scholars Center. And here in the middle, our very own Dr. Ville Sinkkonen, who is a senior research fellow at FIIA and a frequent commentator of US foreign policy in the Finnish media. Ville's research focuses on US foreign policy, great power politics, normative power, and the politics of trust in international relations. And his work has been published in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, Journal of Transatlantic Studies, and European Foreign Affairs Review. He's the author of a book called A Comparative Appraisal of Normative Power, and one of the authors for the Routledge Handbook of Great Power Competition. Now, without further ado, to start off our conversation, I would like to ask each of you about the impact this November election might have on transatlantic relations and foreign and security policy. So when it comes to foreign and security policy, Kori, how do you perceive the main differences and similarities between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris?
So I think on foreign and defense policy, they're quite significant. It's less clear on defense policy what either of the two candidates would support in terms of spending or how they think about the use of force. With former President Trump, we have 4 years of experience, more than 4 years of experience. The main difference, I think, is that President Trump genuinely doesn't believe that allies are advantageous to the United States, and will impose an enormous chaos premium on foreign policy because of the way he thinks about alliances he thinks about American participation in alliances as the equivalent of an insurance company, where if you don't pay your premium as he sets the premium, you don't merit services, as opposed to, I think, the much more common view in both political parties that alliances are sacred trusts, are commitments to each other, and that by making those commitments, you lower the risk and you lower the cost of everything you try and do in the world. I think that's the main difference.
Thank you. How about you, Derek?
Well, I generally agree with Kori. She's much more polite about President Trump's views. But you don't have to take my word for it, because he keeps saying what he intends to do. We totally agree, Kori, it's going to be very chaotic. And one point I would make is in the first term, there were professional, experienced grown-ups in his government. Rex Tillerson was Secretary of State, H.R. McMaster, military background, John Bolton, long history in national security. He basically fired these people and got rid of them and complained that they had said no to him about things. And he's been very clear that he is not going to have such people in this administration to come if he wins. He doesn't want anyone saying no to him. He's also been quite clear about what he is going to do about the war in Ukraine. And this, of course, affects Finland, but all of your different countries here in Europe. Yesterday, in an interview setting, not really an interview, a talk with President Zelensky, he said that were he to be elected, immediately he would create a peace deal. He would call it a fair deal, fair to both sides. He didn't say a word about Putin's aggression on Ukraine. He never has. And he has said during the campaign trail that he would solve everything because he would sit down. Putin's a reasonable man. And this is very similar to what he said about the riots in Charlottesville when there were Nazis and racists rioting. He said, there are good people on both sides. So that's what he's saying about the war in Ukraine. There are good people on both sides. I think the practical effect is that he would try to create a peace conference that would temporarily perhaps create a ceasefire that might seem like peace. Putin would get lots of things out of it, and then he would just wait. So I think you should be very concerned about that situation, should he win. As to the rest of the world and what he would do, you don't know. As Kori said, it will be chaotic, but my university classmate, John Bolton, when asked about what does President Trump believe, what really is his worldview, other than his general America first, or as Kori says, that the rest of the world has to pay us to take care of them, Bolton said he believes in one thing, Donald Trump. So that's going to be the basis of his foreign policy and his domestic policy. What is best for Donald Trump?
Thank you. How about you, Ville? Differences, similarities between Trump and Harris?
Yeah, there's plenty, obviously. I'm in a difficult position because the other two speakers have done such a great job here. You have very different visions for America, and you have very different visions for America's role in that world. I mean, you have your American carnage, redux, in the case of Trump, and then you have Kamala Harris's sort of forward-looking vision of we're not going back. And I think then the international and the domestic sides sort of go hand in hand there. When it comes to Trump, I mean, like Kori said, like Derek already said, we've got plenty of empirical evidence to gauge. So then it's more a question of what the analytical lens is that we use for gauging all that information. And my 2 cents is that Trump is an unsentimental transactionalist. And this is a kind of a simplistic form of transactionalism. He breaks the world down into bilateral transactions. This is more tactical than strategic. And on top of this, he's clearly a bit petty and vindictive, and this is not an ideal combination. So what you would have with Trump 2.0 in terms of the international domain is Trump 1.0 on steroids. So you can bargain over everything, whether it's Ukrainian sovereignty, US security guarantees. Alliances are resource drains, they're expendable. International institutions tie US hands, they impinge on US sovereignty. Values, democracy, freedom, rule of law, they're trivial questions. And external diffusions into the country, whether you're looking at goods or people, are inherently a bad thing. And climate change is a non-issue. Now, on the Harris side, I mean, I'm going to use a dirty word here, but she's clearly a liberal internationalist. She's a progressive liberal internationalist, likely, but she believes in a complex and interdependent world, and then obviously appreciates the complexity of all these foreign policy issues that we're talking about. So alliances would be force multipliers. They're the foundation of US global leadership or co-leadership. Institutions are vital for upholding the US's role in the world. Certain values are intrinsically important, whether it's freedom, the rule of law, democracy, etc., even if the US does not always go the full mile in upholding them and acting consistently. which we'll probably get into as this panel moves forward. And of course, she's much more rounded on questions of immigration, also questions of trade. But this does not mean a return to a free trade consensus, right?
I was going to say, I think you're imputing a lot more to her than we actually know about her.
But Kori, we do have some evidence. She's been vice president. She has learned a lot in her travels. A number of my friends are U.S. ambassadors who've hosted her in their countries. They said that she has, like your president, Stu, she has a great touch with people. She handles complex briefings and issues well, and she also dances. So, for example, on a trip to Zambia, she was singing and dancing with women, but she also could sit down and discuss the corruption issue. I know personally her foreign policy advisor, Philip Gordon. He's a long-standing professional foreign service officer, very grounded, a Europeanist, and the people who she talks to and listens to are not all that dissimilar from the people you're seeing in the Biden administration, except there'll be a change of personnel. I suspect there'll be more women. There might be a woman Secretary of Defense. There are a lot of Biden bros at the moment kind of doing things for the president. And some of that will change, but I think we all agree that the foreign policy would not look dissimilar to the Biden administration in terms of the reliance on alliances, working with our allies, and of course, dealing with the very complex issues of authoritarian governments in China and Russia and Iran.
I think we actually don't know how a President Harris would deal with China, would deal with Syria, would deal with Iran. We don't have any evidence, and I think there's a temptation to impute all manner of goodness and effectiveness to her just because Trump is so bad, and I think we need to be a little bit more cautious on that.
Yeah, well, we disagree about that. She lives down the block from me in Los Angeles, and I do know her, and I know people around her, and I know her record in California. So I'm not worried about it, Kori, but the problem, of course, is that the problems are not simple. And no president, no matter how experienced, has a magic answer. I mean, what do we do about the fact that Israel is bombing Beirut today, and we face a possible wider war? There's no magic solution for the president to somehow figure out how to get Netanyahu to operate differently. I mean, it doesn't matter how experienced you are. Joe Biden said that Bibi was his good friend, and Bibi plays him all the time and still comes to the United States and endorses his opponents. I mean, it's not easy navigating the current world.
Thank you. Well, to turn to the domestic politics dimension of things, which Ville already mentioned in passing, it's easy to overstate the power of the presidency when it comes to foreign and security policy. It seems likely that during the next presidency, advisors and cabinet secretaries may have quite a lot of influence over policy decisions, perhaps simply because of Harris's relative inexperience with these topics and because of Trump's general lack of interest in governing. And on top of that, it seems likely, or at least possible, that control of Congress will be split after the November election. So how do the three of you foresee these things, kind of the shaping, how do you see the administrations shaping out under Trump or Harris? What do you think the balance of power in Congress is going to be? And how do you foresee these things impacting foreign and security policy in the next 4 years? Maybe let's start with Kori again.
Okay. So you're quite right that that Congress really controls much of defense policy, less so foreign policy. Whenever Congress starts meddling in foreign policy, the administration should understand it's just a vote of no confidence. It doesn't mean Congress will do it any better, and very often they will do it worse than the president would do. But on defense policy, I mean, Congress added $28 billion to President Biden's first defense budget. They added $45 billion to his second defense budget. And the Senate bill out of the authorizers is going to add another $37 billion to this last defense budget. So I think you can expect Congress to continue to be assertive. They feel like the administration hasn't put the money in to improve the military as much as our adversaries are improving their militaries. And I think you can see that, you're likely to see that continue. I agree with you that Congress is a toss-up, but so the seats that are under contention, so the entirety of the House of Representatives gets elected every 2 years, a third of the Congress, a third of the Senate. It looks right now like the Senate may be in Republican hands and the House will be in Democratic hands, which Americans like divided government. I think the thing to always remember about American government is that we have a government created by people who don't like government. And so power gets distributed really widely because we don't like our own government. What you were likely to see a less rambunctious Congress if Republicans are in control of the Senate rather than the House, because the smaller House districts are more amenable to gerrymandering. So you get the Freedom Caucus, the Republicans in the House who voted to shut the United States government down last week. There's less of that kind of republicanism in the Senate because it's harder to win statewide races. So I think there'll be a mild advantage towards calm, predictable American policy if Republicans don't control the House and do control the Senate if you have a Harris presidency. In a Trump administration, I think he's been quite clear about who his cabinet appointment, what the cabinet appointments are likely to look like. And they're likely to look like the people he's put in place the last 3 months of his presidential term. I think there's a likelihood that a President Trump would appoint people who could not get confirmed even by a Republican Senate, so they can serve a few months, and then you'll see a rotation of Mar-a-Lago denizens who can't get confirmed but can be in place for 3 months, which would just be a circus.
Derek, how about you?
Yeah, Kori and I totally agree it would be a circus, and she's right. That's an important point, that Trump's appointees would have to be confirmed, including ambassadors. Some of you may remember that when he won the first time, he fired almost all the ambassadors on day one, and there were many posts that didn't have ambassadors for a year or two. That would certainly happen again, and then he would sort of look for odd people and friends to fill the post. But he doesn't really believe much in diplomacy or ambassadors, so you would find a lot of these places open. The State Department, the last time he won, was in chaos. I met with some of our people here in Helsinki who everybody's assignments went out the window. So it would be a sad circus in terms of American functioning with foreign policy. We don't know who's going to control the Senate or the House. It's going to be very, very close. As Kori said, it's likely but not inevitable that the Republicans might take the Senate. The House is going to come down to a number of very close races, including some in California. The election itself is going to be very close, and it's going to come down to certain key swing states. I think that what's interesting in terms of foreign policy is Americans' public views. There have been a number of polls on a number of issues. One is Russia. Needless to say, Russia's not very popular in the US, but it's also the case that most Americans actually don't care about the war in Ukraine. A lot of them have no idea where it is. It's not something of interest, and the fact that American troops are not there doesn't really concern them. On China, China is incredibly unpopular now in the US, and I'm sure Kori would agree that a lot of members of the Congress are going to be more, not so much extreme, but activist on China and push whoever's in the White House to get tougher on China. The public doesn't have a very good view of China, but they still like to purchase Chinese goods at Walmart. So there's that ongoing contradiction between economic globalization and foreign policy. The only foreign policy issue that really touches us at home at the moment, sadly, is the war in Gaza. And as you all know, that's been the subject of demonstrations and counter demonstrations on our campuses. It could be an issue that turns the election because of Arab American voters in the state of Michigan. They are very unhappy with the Biden administration, and there have been talk about not so much voting for Donald Trump, but not voting. In a close election, to lose Michigan would probably cost Harris the election. We don't know. We also don't know what will happen if a wider war, as we're trending to now in the Middle East, breaks out in a more extreme form, what effect that will actually have on voters. But I also want to say, and this is very important, don't neglect the Taylor Swift effect. Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris after her last debate, and people think, well, they're just more celebrity endorsements, but actually she has a lot of influence on young women getting them registered to vote and turnout. And this is part of the oddity of American politics. In a close election, something like a Taylor Swift endorsement or the support of LeBron James for Harris might be enough to push just a few voters in key states to win the election, which is, of course, a little odd for foreign policy experts to think that the future of American foreign policy comes down to these kinds of things, but that's how our system works.
Thank you. And what do you think, Ville?
A lot has been said. I mean, one thing I'll touch on, I'll push back a bit on the Harris thing, because obviously she's been vice president for almost 4 years. There's some record. She served on the Intelligence and Homeland Security committees. And she has a foreign policy team that has certain views that kind of would, in my view, allow us to project some liberal internationalist leanings upon her and upon her foreign policy writ large. But she is no transatlanticist of the Biden mold, certainly not. She has a very different background. West Coast, like Kori. Daughter of immigrants. I mean, we would likely see more focus on, hopefully, on the global south, for instance. That's just, again, conjecturing. In terms of a couple of things from the previous discussion, one is the question of China and Trump. I think this is super interesting because you have people in his orbit who are, they're all likely China hawks, but I'm not 100% certain that Trump is as much of a China hawk as some of these people who are populating his orbit. On the economic side, probably yes. The 60% tariffs, whatever, he's happy to bring that up ad infinitum, actually. But in terms of issues like Taiwan, how muscular he's going to be when it comes to questions of security and defense in the Indo-Pacific realm. I think Trump is the wild card when it comes to China policy.
So if I may, I think Ville is exactly right. I would push it even a little bit further. I think the way to understand what Trump would do about China is how he treated North Korea during his presidential term. A belief that he personally can craft this amazing deal, lots of uncertainty, lots of anxiety by allies, and at the end of the day, nothing produced, and eventually it gets ignored. I think that's the roller coaster we're likely to be on in a Trump administration. The other thing I would say is that I don't think we should have any confidence that any of the China hawks around him are going to have any influence over his choices. And during his presidency, I mean, I think he made the deal with the Taliban. He wanted to invite them to Camp David on September 11th. I just think that's how to imagine what it's going to be like.
Let me add one thing about the Senate. One of the things that's changed from when I was younger is that we don't really have any very experienced internationalists in the Senate anymore. John McCain is gone. Senator Fulbright, who was one of the great leaders in the Senate on international issues. Joe Biden, when he was a senator heading the Foreign Relations Committee, well, I mean, the most recent chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, the Democrat Mendez, is indicted. So we're missing in the Senate some of that kind of independent international leadership, and there really isn't too many people in the House either who've been there long enough that have that kind of experience. So as an anchor on American foreign policy independent of the White House, you can't count on the Congress.
All right. Before we turn the floor to the audience, you can start preparing your questions now. But before that, I still have one tailored question for each of you. Kori, how do you see the impact of this election on NATO, the war in Ukraine, and the US force posture in Europe?
I do think that's the point of greatest distinction between the two candidates. That President Trump was fulminating about President Zelensky going to Pennsylvania to thank American workers for having produced the weapons that Ukraine has been fighting with. I think Trump has a sort of weird affinity for authoritarian leaders, and particularly for Vladimir Putin, and that bodes ill for the security of Ukraine, ill for the security of Europe. During the Trump presidency, when he was threatening the South Koreans to triple the amount of host nation support for U.S. troops, threatening to withdraw U.S. troops from Japan, and moving to withdraw U.S. troops from Europe, on a bipartisan basis, Republicans and Democrats in Congress refused him the money to do so. And I think you would see a lot of that. But I don't think we should be too optimistic that Republicans in Congress, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, that Republicans in Congress will show a whole lot of differentiation from the president's policies. Because I think the experience of the last 8 years has been, if voters will vote for Trump, Republicans, for the most part, will fall in line behind him.
Thank you. And Ville, how do you think the results of this election might impact European strategic autonomy? And in your view, how should the US view the European desire for strategic autonomy? And how do you think a Trump or Harris administration might view it?
I know it was a preset question. I'm going to skirt a bit. Look, I totally agree. I mean, I gave you a very alarmist reading of Donald Trump. The key point was the transactionalism. So for Europe, there's sort of two ways. There's two polar opposites of looking at it. One is to be super alarmist, and the other is to be an apologist. And I think neither of these is speaking to the theme of this conference, which is action. And regardless of who sits in the White House, Europe needs to do more. I think, this is if not the consensus view, at least a view that one hears a lot. The issue is that, there's nowhere for Europe to hedge in the short term, and I think hedging is not part of the answer anyway. So we need to work with Trump, and we need to find ways of working with him because we're forced to live with him in the case of a Trump presidency. In the case of Europe, that would mean being proactive and staying united in the face of this kind of what you could call a transactionalist onslaught from Trump. Because, you know, if Europe is united and if Europe has something to offer and bring to the table, united, there's a better chance of, for want of a better term, getting a better deal. Now, the tricky thing is, or it's not a tricky thing, it's just a fact of life, that there are certain long-term trends that pull the US in a less transatlanticist direction. I mean, whether it's this need for both parties to consider the domestic mood when it comes to international engagement, pressure both from the left and the right for a less activist foreign policy, one might say. In the free trade domain, there's not going to be a lot happening, I venture. Industrial policy is back. And then the US focus will ultimately, at some stage, even though they've been pivoting since Obama to Asia, at some stage in the future, the importance of the Indo-Pacific theater will likely dwarf the other theaters internationally. So, Europe needs to up its game regardless of who wins in November. And this requires a proactive approach. And then, of course, the issue with that is there's always going to be some known unknown, to cite Rumsfeld, that will throw a wrench in the plan. I mean, if we look back at the beginning of the Biden administration, he wanted to park the Russia relationship in a garage and then visit it from time to time. Didn't happen that way. So there's the problem with the future, tricky to predict.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pour cold water on the use of the term Europe, but, to me, Europe doesn't exist as a political entity. What exists is NATO, and what exists is the EU, and we all know their histories and structures, and we know the political limitations and also the advantages. Now, neither one of them will disappear if Donald Trump is elected. NATO won't go away, although it might become more chaotic in terms of America's leadership or role. But Finland will still be a member of NATO. It will be cooperating and working with militaries in NATO. So, I mean, that's a very strong reality on the ground that you should all remember. The other thing, though, is there's the economic component to security in the world. And one of the things we're now seeing is that Davos turns out to be based on a false premise, that globalization would bring us this post-Cold War world and spread good feelings and democracy and everybody would want to get wealthy. It turns out you can have authoritarian capitalism. You can have corrupt authoritarian capitalism in Russia. You can have a similar version in China. And I think it's fair to say that both the US and Europe were complicit or had blinders on. I mean, where is Russian money hidden? London. Where do oligarchs have their yachts? France. The same with China. Now, people want to do business in China. You want to have an economic relationship. Germany is still sending, leaders and trade delegations. At the same time, concerned about Chinese role in the world. It's not easy to pull this apart. Some of you may know that there's been discussions now of Chinese EV companies locating their plants inside Germany or Hungary because they're concerned about more anti-Chinese feeling. But how does that economic investment play out and also undercut, in some ways, security policy? It's not an easy thing to figure out. One of the causes, not the main one, but the fact that the US did not pay attention to the losers in globalization. And a lot of those people, especially white working class, who lost their jobs because of the rise of China and to some extent of NAFTA, are lost their status, are angry, upset. And so they buy into this narrative that somehow President Trump can take them back to this 1950s world when America was the premier force, in the world. And it's not going to happen. But sorting out a more balanced globalization, I would argue, is also part of foreign policy and should be part of the debate in trying to figure out a more comprehensive defense and security platform. So, but I would also, urge you to not forget that two biggest achievements in international diplomacy, I would argue, are the creation and spread of the European Union and the creation and expansion of NATO. And those are very good things that anchor the world and make it more secure, even though we have all these other ongoing problems.
Thank you. Now, you already touched upon this, Derek, but how do you foresee economic policy shaping out under Trump or Harris?
Oh, well, and Kori alluded to it, tariffs. I mean, Donald Trump thinks tariffs are a tax on foreign countries. And he's convinced his supporters that foreign countries pay this tax if we raise the tariffs, that it doesn't affect prices or production at home. And I mean, economists left to right understand this is not true. So whether he could or would enact some of the 20 to 60% tariffs, we don't know. He will try. It could lead, we don't want to go back to the 30s when you had tariffs that spread across the country, world protectionism, but that's his major economic policy. And then he says with the tariff revenue, the taxes that foreign companies pay, foreign governments, he will then fund the US government. It's a fairy tale, but again, it's just going to be chaotic. Beyond that, he wants to cut taxes again, and cut taxes again on billionaires if possible. And he also has a program for taking apart the federal government, removing the civil service protections that were put in at the end of the 19th century to end the sale and patronage of jobs in the federal government. It was one of our more progressive things. It happened because President Garfield was assassinated. And after him, kind of in his honor, they passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act that created a professional, independent federal government. And Trump has said they're going to take that apart if they possibly can so that there can be a political test for people working in the federal government. I mean, that will be chaotic.
Thank you. Now it's time for questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones circulating. I see a hand up over there. Could you please? If you could please introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you so much.
Right. I'm Mark Katz. I'm the chair of the Scientific Advisory Council here at FIIA. And my question is, Joe Biden has been described as the last Zionist president in America. He obviously has a emotional attachment to Israel, remembering it from before 1967. Kamala Harris has been more critical of Israel, more sympathetic with the Palestinians. And Donald Trump, while supportive of Israel, has issued several very disturbing statements about American Jews and what should happen to them if they don't support him. So I'm just wondering, in other words, have we reached sort of a change in America with regard to policy toward the Middle East? In other words, certainly as someone who spent 35 years as a professor, one thing I've noticed is that young Americans are not as supportive of Israel. And I don't mean just liberals, but conservatives as well, who kind of apply a Trump measure to Israel as well as to other allies. And I'm just sort of wondering, do you foresee any change in American policy with regard to this part of the world, or are these simply, in other words, that the powers that be with regard to American policy toward Israel are simply too strong to be changed by changes in public opinion? Thank you.
So I think you're right that there is an age gap in support for Israel. I think more important even than that is that you have seen a shift in who among Americans is supportive of Israel. It used to be Jewish Americans were the basis for the kind of center of gravity of the relationship. And now it's evangelical Christians, and it's evangelical Christians of all ages. So I think you're unlikely to see a major policy change. And Vice President Harris,
Post has issued a study indicating that young evangelicals' support for Israel has fallen. In other words, the Israelis fear they're losing young evangelicals.
okay, I think we shouldn't ignore the extent to which Prime Minister Netanyahu's politicization of the relationship also feeds into that. All that said, I'm skeptical a President Harris is going to have very different policies on the Middle East than President Biden does. President Trump would, I think, endorse some of the most extreme attitudes about Palestinian depopulation of Gaza and the West Bank, for example, which would not only affect the U.S.-Israeli relationship, given domestic attitudes in Israel, but would also have a major effect on how other countries look at American foreign policy.
Yeah, I agree with Kori about that. And, you know, I mentioned earlier all the turmoil that's going on inside the U.S., particularly in the coastal states and university towns around Israel. And that's part of the problem. Is it's not support for Israel in a general sense, but support for Netanyahu, who's the worst president in Israel's history, in my view. Is supporting him is not the same thing as being supportive of Israel. But, you know, having said that, the two-state solution, which has been American policy, is still Biden-Harris policy, looks very distant because the Netanyahu government has made it clear that that will never happen. And if you look at how Israel has changed in recent years in terms of the composition of the population and the politics, that outcome doesn't look very politically possible politically inside Israel. And so some of the initiatives that the Biden administration had thought about playing the Saudi Arabian card and sort of trading Saudi Arabia's recognition and economic investment in Israel and in Gaza for an agreement to seek a two-state solution now looks kind of very distant or a pipe dream. That's still our policy. But to come back to any of those kind of grand diplomatic solutions will take an end to the war. And we don't see an end. So, you know, it's rather bleak, but America isn't not going to walk away from its support or alliance for Israel, but I don't know how long, if the war keeps going or spreads, patience for a wider war is going to be very low in the United States.
I'm going to have to agree with Kori and Derek. This is kind of getting boring in that regard. But look, the question with Harris being more rounded, perhaps on the question of Israel and Gaza than Biden, probably yes. But whether that will translate into a policy change, I'm not necessarily convinced. it's the issue with the Middle East is it's so complex. You pull on one end of the yarn and then another one comes loose. So if you look at the Trump era, I mean, there's certain foreign policy achievements, shall we say. I think the Abraham Accords is one that's often pointed to. Now, the tricky thing about the Abraham Accords, of course, was that they essentially sidelined the Palestinian issue. And that has certain reverberations in the region today. So it is such a complex puzzle, and it is also very hard to sort of carry out a policy change on the part of the US that would have the desired effect in the region because it is so complex. It's such a difficult puzzle.
More questions? Anyone? I think here was one of the first hands to shoot up originally.
So, Ben Hodges, for each of the three of you, what specific recommendation would you make to the Finnish government if there is to be a Trump administration? What would be something that's unique to Finnish interests that you'd be worried about or would want to address with a Trump administration?
Willie, why don't you go first this time?
Okay. I think Finland has a story to tell. I think part of that story was told on the first day of this conference. We're a security provider. We're not a security consumer. The thing about the Trump era and Finland bilaterally, and I know there are people in the audience who are partly sort of responsible for this, we did pretty well in the first 4 years of the Trump era in terms of the bilateral relationship. I mean, it deepened across the board, especially in the defense realm. So I mean, I don't think there's a need to change that narrative, honestly. That's my 2 cents.
I think there will be a real temptation among countries like Poland and Finland to break ranks with other Europeans because the beauty contest of who Trump will actually like and be decent to will be pretty intense among Europeans, and a Trump administration will work hard to exacerbate those frictions. My advice would be to play team sports for exactly the reason Willie said in his opening remarks, which is that if Europeans hold together, they're much more likely to be able to pull a Trump administration, or at least some of the more reasonable voices in a Trump administration and Congress, to European positions.
Yeah, and I agree. And the one thing I would advise against is don't go into the flattery game, buying him gold-plated golf clubs and, playing to his ego, because it doesn't really get you anywhere, and it's embarrassing for countries that do it.
Pretty well.
And also, as I said earlier, you're going to be a member of NATO, and you deepen that relationship as you already are with your military cooperation and dealing with military professionals. That's not going to go away. And you can also deepen your diplomatic engagement with our different states. One of the strategies that a number of countries have used is to sign agreements with state and cities. The state of California, for example, has signed agreements with
China,
New Zealand, with Finland on climate change issues. Find issues that you can work with Americans on where you don't have to go through Washington and the Trump administration.
Thank you. More questions? Over there, please.
Thank you for a fascinating panel. David Korpela from the EU Office of the Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. You mentioned the Global South, and we just had a compelling speech at the UN from the Finnish president on the need for Europe to reset its relationship with the Global South and to reform some of the international organizations. How do you see that aspect playing out in transatlantic relations? Will it be a point of convergence or of divergence as we look to kind of engage with that issue?
Also, well, I would also add, and I tell my students all the time, the global south doesn't exist except in a generalization. Europe doesn't exist except as an almost meaningless generalization in terms of actually operationalizing how you behave in international affairs. So you have to think about particular countries, you have to speak about strategies. The one thing I will say about if Harris is president will be interesting is that some of you may know this, her father's a very famous Jamaican economist who developed a whole economic plan for Jamaica. Her mother's an immigrant from India. She has relatives in India. So she's going to have interesting personal public diplomacy relationships with parts of the global south that I think will be very useful in foreign policy. But, what does one do or say about, say, India, which continues to buy Russian weapons and buy Russian oil? And you can't just sort of lump them, India, into the global south. What do you do about South Africa? You have to be more specific, and you have to work out strategies that involve economic development, climate change, public diplomacy, and not sort of fall back on these kind of easy my students drive me crazy. We're for the global south and, not for imperialist America or, the old people. It's like, that's non-thinking. You got to think concretely and specifically about actions that would be useful.
So I'm skeptical that either of the two candidates for the presidency will invest a lot of time or effort in institutional reform, in expanding the UN Security Council or changing its composition or any of the Bretton Woods organizations, because the issues of war and peace right now among the great powers seem so pressing, and I think that'll soak up most of the bandwidth.
I think there is common ground, and you mentioned sort of concrete initiatives. You have the PGII under the G7 auspices. You have these sort of attempts at getting to a concrete project level. I would imagine that the EU has its global gateway. There's ways to work with the United States and more broadly the quote unquote democratic West writ large to have a positive impact in various regions of the global south that only exist on paper.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more question.
We haven't had any women, have we?
Over here.
Well, only because I'm a woman, I hope. There we go.
No, but we're trying to be diverse here.
Thank you. Happy to serve that goal. So good morning. Thank you for a great start of the day. Very relevant. My name is Nevahat Albayrak, and I work for the Finnish energy company Fortum. And I had the privilege to be part of a Finnish delegation of businesses to the US last week. We visited Washington and spoke with Republicans and Democrats. Thank you, Risto, for organizing that visit. So one thing that the Democrats and the Republicans seem to agree on is the fact that the Republicans are much better prepared this time, both policy-wise and organization-wise, so administration. I was a bit surprised to hear both of you, Kori and Derek, say basically, there would be more of the same, circus, chaos, etc., some of the words you used. In fact, having been to the Heritage Foundation and listening to some of the people who may be in the administration if Trump wins, they did come across much better prepared and with a well-thought-through policy and ideas about who would be in the administration. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we did ask the Democrats where the equivalent is of a policy view strategy to help the next Democrat president. And they had to admit there was none like very well-organized, integrated view on a Democrat, maybe more progressive vision. So would you agree that, that there is indeed learnings from the first Trump presidency that is now making them more prepared?
Well,
And if I may, a very short second question. So the other thing they agreed on, Democrats and Republicans, is nobody dared to predict the outcome. Now, having the privilege of having the two of you here, especially Derek, well, all three of you actually, would you dare to place a bet on the outcome of the elections?
no, that's silly. I don't predict elections. You analyze the situation. I've tried to do that to you. It's going to be very close. It's going to be very close, and it's going to come down to relatively small groups of voters that don't show up exactly in the polls. And I'll just give you a couple of specific examples. State of Wisconsin. Will more black voters turn out in Milwaukee to offset more conservative white voters? In Arizona, there's going to be an initiative on the ballot involving abortion rights. Will that bring more women out to affect the account of the election? We do not know the answer to that until we see how people vote. You can bet on the election, you know, international betting things, but I think what you have to look at is what's happening inside American society, and what we know is the country is very polarized, and it will depend a lot on who actually shows up to vote on election day, and you'll be able to watch it all live with the CNN interactive maps. Now, I think you shouldn't overplay what some groups of people who want to be back in government tell you about how well planned they are. As Kori said, they have no idea what Trump's going to do. I mean, I have a friend, Republican friend from Los Angeles named Robert O'Brien. Now, he'd like to be Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State. He wrote a very calm, rational article in Foreign Affairs about what a Trump foreign policy would be. One of the things he suggested is that we would move our entire U.S. Marine Corps, how's that, General Hodges, to Asia, because that's what's important. We have to counter China. Now, would that actually happen? Who knows? But is he going to be in the government? I wouldn't bet on it. It's impossible to really know, except that it's not going to be very many grown-ups, as I suggested the way last time. And also, as Kori said, whether they can even get confirmed by the Senate. And if you want to sort of say, is there a plan for the Trump administration? Well, there are these detailed studies. It's called 2025, that the American Enterprise Heritage Institute supported. Now, you can read it. It's pretty scary, serious stuff if it were actually enacted. And I have some friends who are saying, well, you should have read Mein Kampf and taken it seriously, so now you've got to read 2025 and take it seriously, because if they actually did it, it would totally disrupt the US government. But I tell them, well, don't panic about it, because it's not clear. Trump has said he's never heard of it or read it. And of course, that's not true, but it doesn't mean he's actually going to do it. We don't really know who he would put in the government or what he would do, other than we know how transactional he is and how he's concerned with his own ego. So, and yes, there are tremendous Democratic plans. You can talk to any of the leaders of the House. They have a whole set of bills that they were unable to pass, a voting rights bill, minimum wage bill. There's a whole agenda of action, but it requires a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress to do it. So there's not much point in writing more utopian what-if scenarios for a world that doesn't exist.
I think the fact that a sitting vice president in an administration becoming president means that there's not likely to be a big paper trail of all the ways they're going to do things differently. I think it's in her interest to project continuity at this point. And I agree that the Heritage Institution has great plans. Lots of people have great plans, but President Trump disavows them every time they come to the fore, because he thinks, you know, it's always, as Willie said, it's always about him. So I think it's harder to tell than it sounds like you perceived. What I would say about the election is that it's entirely possible we will see a 261 vote tie in the Electoral College and have the election thrown into the House of Representatives. That happened in 1873, it happened in 1800, and it's entirely possible we are as closely navigated as that. But I could also make you a pretty good case for a Trump blowout. I could also make you a pretty good case for a Harris blowout. American voters are feisty, and so it's really hard for me to say. I wouldn't bet a ton of my money in any direction at this point.
I think these are good words to close on. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the excellent questions and for your engaged
And let me say,
attendance.
stay tuned, it will be televised.
Thank you very much.